say, right, that yes, I know change is happening and so on and so forth, right? And yet, in like those crucial moments of decision making, when the stress comes in and so on, it's very difficult to actually go and choose that alternate path, the one that's communicating that I'm adapting to a situation. And as we know as well, as leaders, you've got to be quite nimble in terms of how you're approaching your conversations, how you're approaching the decision-making process, because very often, and more frequently as well, we get to make our decisions with less and less structured, less and less certain, and less full picture information. So that all requires us to adapt. And I would like to talk to you today about 3 traps that our brain is sort of setting up for us leaders when it comes to actually developing adaptability and implementing it in real life situations. The 3 are the following: need for cognitive closure. And I know it sounds quite eloquent, but it is a very simple system that is almost prehistoric. And I would like to tell you a little bit about that today, more in detail. That's where we will focus on. Why this? Because I think this really fundamentally reshapes how we understand adaptability and gives us the very starting point of building it. So every single one of you who wants to work on leadership, this will be the place that you'll start from. I'll also mention at the end the identity fusion and the default mode network, because these are also quite important. They connect the neuroscience, the psychology, and the business acumen that we all have to kind of quite fluently navigate throughout our decision-making processes. So without further ado, there are 2 things you have to understand about the brain before we can explain what this first trap really is. And as you take a look at where we are at in our brain, we've got this bigger circle on your screen, which is this element of your brain, the area of your brain that's right before behind your forehead. It is nicely called prefrontal cortex, but we can think about that. I want you to remember it as the CEO of your brain. Okay, this is where all the planning and decision making happens. This is where the emotion regulation and impulse delay comes in, our working memory processing, and most importantly, our executive functions and the attention. So this is the place that decides analytically, critically, and logically, right? This is the CEO of our brain. Like in an organization, it gets the input from a lot of different places and analyzes, and then it decides. Now, amygdala, which is much deeper in our brain, I want you to think about that as the crisis management center. And as you can imagine, crisis management center, when it comes to the forefront and it starts deciding in the crisis, there's not always time to go to the CEO and lay out all of the analysis that we've got and kind of suggest 5 different scenarios of what we could do here and so on and so forth, right? Crisis management center has to act fast. So in our brain, that thing exactly happens. It detects the threat and then it issues a rapid emotional response. Right? It is encoding our emotions. So it is basically interpreting and categorizing. It's like, okay, this is a threat and this is level 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on, right? Obviously, figuratively speaking, the actual numbers don't happen in the brain, right? But it is encoding the emotions, it is interpreting it, and basically it is regulating our anxiety and stress levels and forming some of the emotional memory as well. Why is this important to differentiate between these 2 areas? And you as a leader absolutely have to understand how the 2 work, because they work exclusively. What does that mean? That means that if this is working, the amygdala is not. If amygdala is working, this is not. Does that make sense? So if they work exclusively, as you can see here on the diagram, on the left side, we've got a strong prefrontal cortex. So our CEO has a strong control, top-down control on everything that you're doing. It analyzes, it processes, it critically assesses, right? What to do, how to decide, what to respond. If amygdala switches on, so our crisis management center, the prefrontal cortex goes black. What does that mean? That means it does not function actively. We can see that on fMRI scores, right? And that means that actually what we tend to do is we are becoming reactive. We are not processing in terms of, logical, critical, analytical, right? Not even creatively thinking. That is also definitely impaired when our amygdala, so our crisis management center, gets to power, right? You can see under the picture, this has been the research that was done initially for medical practice. But I think if you look on the right side of examples of what are the clinical consequences of actually functioning by our crisis management center, you see that this is very relevant to everybody who is a leader, right? It makes you prone to errors. It makes you more exhausted when you're managing complex tasks. Let me ask you, how many of you do not have complex tasks, right? It makes us it makes our commitment decreased, right? So that means it makes it more difficult for us to actually choose to be professional and not emotional, for example. It makes you prone to biases, right? Maybe in like a left kind of system. So if you are alert and if you are on this CEO management, let's say, right, then in a stressful situation, you would then choose to behave like you've studied, for example, on some communication course. But if a crisis management gets to power, whatever you've studied on your communication course is not going to actually be able to be accessed. That means that your brain literally does not have access to the information that's stored in long-term memory at that point. It does not go there. It acts within the central, the crisis management center. So it's extremely important for us to be able to differentiate between these two and where is our decision coming from. Now, if you think about that, how much time does that take to recognize for the brain which one to turn on? Whether it should be thinking with your CEO or it should be thinking with your crisis management center. If anybody can, in their mind, think about a number, how fast does that go? It is under, so less than 39 milliseconds. Milliseconds, right? So it's not even long enough for me to demonstrate that time to you, because before I say start and stop, the time has passed, right? So it is continuously 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. It is scanning and deciding whether one or the other turns on. What happens if our crisis management center turns on? Then that means that our adrenaline shoots out, right? You can experience increased heart rate, maybe blood pressure, dilation of your airways, right? Very often. Why? Because this has been evolutionarily designed to make us fight or flight, right? I'm sure you've all heard that expression. That is coming from that. That is a sign that your crisis management center is on. And I guarantee you there is not a person in the world that can make a rational decision in that moment. It's just not how it biologically works, right? If that it takes seconds, right? If that is not stopped, or our crisis management center, in other words, doesn't get an information that it is safe and we can switch back on our CEO, then the cortisol follows, right? That's minutes later. It increases our glucose levels. And why does that do it? Because adrenaline has never been designed to keep us in that state. It's the cortisol that tries to keep your body in this alertness mode. Yeah. Now, it maintains that alertness, and when chronic, it inhibits. So it means that it makes our CEO, the prefrontal cortex, more dysfunctional. So the longer we are operating in this crisis management center, which was designed to be there for minutes, not months or years, as sometimes people operate under stress, right? The longer it does, the more it impacts the actual effectiveness and capability of our prefrontal cortex, so our CEO. Ultimately, the longer we remain stressed, the worse are getting our skills of decision making, for example, under uncertainty. So what's the point of that? Well, the point is for us to actually be able to learn how to swiftly switch between those two systems, right? Because it is a biological and automatic reaction. What does that mean? That you cannot turn off your crisis management center. It will always turn on when it sees threat. That's how we've been designed. It's supposed to keep us safe, right? So there's no way you can actually turn it off, or that it doesn't work this way in your brain. It works like that for every single one of us. But we have to learn how to swiftly switch. Why? Because as you can see on an fMRI scan on the right, if we are applying the resilient coping mechanisms, right, and techniques, then we are able to reactivate our CEO, right? So if we are skilled in how we recognize what is happening with our brain, then we are able to actively promote how fast our CEO will switch back on. On the right-hand side, you can see that if we're, for example, ignoring, pretending it doesn't exist, trying to compartmentalize and say, I'll deal with that later, all of these things do not switch back on our CEO. What does that mean? That means your decision-making and your reactiveness is still up. The decision-making is still more reactive than proactive or logical. Okay, so now we've said that the brain is scanning all the time, right? And it decides whether one system turns on or the other. So what is that one criteria that makes it choose this or that? It's a threat. And if the threat is detected, then our crisis management center turns on. If the threat is not detected, that means we can still operate within the full capability of our CEO. Now, what is coded in our brain as threat? It is fear, anxiety, anger, but also we now know, and that's quite revolutionary to understand, uncertainty and decision fatigue. So uncertainty is causing your brain to go exactly the same kind of spiral as, let's say, meeting a bear in a forest. And now let's think about that, right? How many times a day as a leader, especially in some, hugely disrupted services, or if you're in oil and gas, for example, right now, right, with everything happening in the world, how many times a day we have to think about things that are uncertain? That means that many times a day, your crisis management turns on. And that means that much more important this skill is for you to be able to swiftly switch between one and the other. Okay, a little quiet reflection for everybody, and you can get back to that after our call, just being mindful of time. You can think about last time that you actually felt significant stress or pressure. And when that happened, what did you notice in terms of your physical sensations? These can give you a signal that this is your amygdala speaking, not your CEO, right? It can be the breathing, the tension, the heart rate. And what was your immediate impulse? Quick decision, avoidance, defense, seeking a certainty. This is going to tell us what is this reactiveness that our brain by default goes to. And then whether you wanted to make a decision or an urgent or a good decision. Why is that differentiation important? Because in the moment that your amygdala is speaking, this is how you can recognize that. You're going to notice you want to just make a decision because your brain is trying to go back to safety, and safety means certainty. So we just want to make a decision. Does not matter whether it's a good or bad one. And that is exactly what need for cognitive closure is. It's the brain's desire to resolve our ambiguity as quickly as possible, even if it means choosing the wrong answer. So as a leader, even if it means going against the strategic objective, even if it means going against the training. Yeah. Now that paired with two other traps, the identity fusion, the way how we've been talking to ourselves about our leadership, plus default mode network, which is almost like default setting on your phone that you've been training for years before you became your leader. If you're not aware of these two additional traps paired with the need for cognitive closure, that's how we get those reactions that we feel like we can never scrap out of our behavioral toolkit, right? So it's extremely important for us to understand and reframe how we're looking at adaptability. Adaptability doesn't exist without a regulated nervous system. So if we want to start building adaptability, it actually means first examining what is happening with your nervous system, and only then we can start looking at the other two traps, which are developed by awareness in leadership, to actually make ourselves a lot more adaptable and future ready. And ultimately, future ready leaders are the ones that are learning how the brain works. Because think about that. If we're managing people and people operate how our brains operate, if you're a leader, not knowing the one organ in our body that dictates that is kind of absolutely unacceptable. So I hope that this is going to inspire you guys to explore a little bit more about how our brain works and what we know. And with that, I will turn to Aisha to reflect. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary, for this very awesome insight that even as a CEO, you still have a CEO.
Yeah.
So that is what completes us as leaders. And it's so refreshing to bring this into a very digestible and relatable context. Because when you hear prefrontal cortex, then you start thinking that's too clinical, that's too medical. But in reality, as leaders, we should really understand these things. It's just like knowing our heart rates, our blood pressure. So if we're able to relate with our heart, our cardio, and know the numbers, then we should, take as much interest to really deeply dive into how our brain works. Because as leaders, our brains are always needed for ourselves and for the teams that, we lead. And for me, I think the biggest takeaway is being able to understand that understanding your default is the beginning of you realizing the control that you can have to a certain extent. Because allowing your brain to just be in a default mode of flight or fright continuously has a way of depriving you of being in a better control of understanding your system and how your brain works. Okay, so it's very important that as future ready leaders that we begin to really understand PFC, cortisol, our adrenaline rush, and when these things happen, what to do is to pause. We do need to pause at that moment if, we are challenged or, we're compelled to just not do anything or afraid to take the next step. We're humans at the end of the day, right? Even as leaders, we are humans, right? So we need to face that reality. And I keep saying that as leaders, it's okay to be vulnerable. You're not a robot. You have to be human. You have to really understand who you are, what your capability is. All right. And not pretending that, you're a RoboCop and, you've got all the answers. No, I think, it's a big thing to know. And the strong thread here is that leaders are increasingly required to act with less structure, less certainty, and less complete information. So the example that you raised about, oil and gas, anyone that's in there really, and even insurance, I really can't imagine what they're going through really at this point. It's a crisis that they did not anticipate. Of course, they've probably done their simulations, before now, the what if scenarios and things like that. But I think the level of impact that we're realizing globally has been one that is unprecedented. So these are times where, your amygdala, your PFC is tested. So it's a moment of silence, it's a moment of pausing, it's a moment of realizing, who am I in this situation? Am I capable? And if I'm not, what do I need to do? I need to really understand my system. It's not just constantly relating or leaning towards my team or leaning towards, the information that I get. Sometimes the information is so haphazard. It's not enough, but people are relying on you to take a decision. Another thing I took note of is that with these two competing systems for leadership to respond with the PFC as your CEO and your amygdala as the crisis management, I mean, in your brain, you already have a situation room going on there. It's powerful, but it just reminds us that leadership is not just behavioral, it's psychological. It's really, really psychological. So when the CEO is active, we analyze, we regulate. And then when it's the crisis management that takes over, we react, our thinking narrows, and then a lot of reactions, come into play. Now, being under threat, our ability to lead well is constrained, all right? And one of the most important insights is that when the brain detects threat, as you've described it shifts extremely quickly. And that 39 milliseconds you described is exactly that turning point. So it means that leadership responses are being shaped constantly by conscious reasoning and being fully engaged. So we really need to be present in that moment and not to be too distant from it, so it's very important. So the issue is not simply whether leaders know what good leadership looks like. The issue is whether in a pressured moment, the brain is even in a state that allows access to that learning. All right. And then adaptability begins with regulation. A major implication for this session is that adaptability cannot be treated purely as a mindset. It begins with the ability to recognize when the crisis management center has taken over and when to recover quickly from the CEO to return. So that shift, that pendulum that we feel in our brains is something that we need to master over time. It's not something that we're all going to learn tonight or today or in 2 weeks. It's just something that through micro habits, we'll be able to adopt and integrate it into our daily routines. So for me, I think the final thing I would like to just mention is that this session just reminds us that adaptability is simply not willingness, okay? It's about whether the brain is in a state that can support good judgment. And one of the strongest takeaways here is that stress does not change how we feel. It changes what we are able to access cognitively. So the science does come in, and we really need to understand that science. We really need to get to terms with this words, this terminology about prefrontal cortex, like I said, and the other things that relate to how our brain works, how our brains are wired, just the way we know everything that has to do with our cardio rates and our cardio numbers and our triggers, when to avoid them, what to do to slow down, what to do to manage our stress. So yeah, I think those are the key things. So what I would take away from this is that adaptability begins much earlier than behavior. It begins in physiology, in awareness, and in regulation. So if we want future-ready leaders, we must build people and ourselves who can think clearly under pressure, recognize when reactivity has taken over, and return quickly to that deliberate or intentional judgment. That may be one of the most important leadership disciplines of our time. So I will leave us with those little nuggets and food for thought to see how we can begin to imbibe some of these things and, be better leaders and be able to judge more constructively and productively. Yeah. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Michael.
Yeah, thank you so much, Aisha. Thank you for that reflection. An amazing presentation, Mary. Quite insightful, and yeah, it draws you in to start to see how the neuroscience and the physiology of within us regulate the decisions we make, our behaviors, and how we respond to things. So quite interesting. Because of time, I will quickly get to the questions. We do have one question, and I'd like to ask that very quickly. So Girima Tona says, in what ways does the brain's response to stress shape a leader's judgment during a crisis?
Well, in
Yeah.
every single way, actually. Think about it this way, that whatever we kind of process consciously, so that means, you know, all of our studying, all of our training, all of the knowledge that we sort of acquire, it gets stored in a specific part of the brain, which is, for example, the long-term memory, right? Now, when the stress situation happens that we have no sort of awareness of, and we don't train the tactics of getting our amygdala, so the crisis management center, a signal like, hey, it's okay, we are safe, so we are not able to reactivate our prefrontal cortex, then biologically your brain is not going to go to the box in which you stored all of that knowledge. It biologically is just not going to open the deck, right? So in every single way, it is shaping the way that you respond. No, not for nothing. We sort of say that, you know, I often have clients that come to me and say, like, you know, I've been to like a million leadership trainings, and yet still sometimes I lash out on somebody. It's like, yes, you do, because all of those things you've learned, you don't access in moments of your crisis management center taking over. Again, this is an automatic system, which means in kind of like neuroscience, when something's automatic, it means you've got absolutely zero control whether it turns on or not. So it will always turn on. The only thing that we can do consciously is to be able to, first of all, increase our awareness as a leader. So we are able to detect when it turns on. And these are some of those little nuggets I tried to give you in terms of whether you are trying to make a decision or whether you're trying to make a good decision. If you're noticing you're really focused on just making a decision, that means that it is not your CEO speaking. It is your crisis management speaking, right? There are a number of other things that we can look out for, but for that, we need awareness, right? That's why the awareness is kind of like a connective tissue between the two. I've been looking at the chat and you guys have been fantastic with asking also some additional questions. I saw there. There's one that I really, really want to kind of respond to, that somebody said they've learned our crisis center needs 90 seconds to bring us back to the prefrontal cortex being activated. And that is not necessarily absolutely true. So it depends, because now if we're operating in a chronic stress, which a lot of the global population is, right, that means that you're operating in stress for more than a couple of minutes a day, in short spurts of time, right? Because stress is not all bad. If you have a stress, even intense stress, for just a little bit, and then you've got time to kind of debrief and like calm down and so on. And then again, for example, that is okay because it was designed to work that way. If you are getting into a stressful situation and you never get back down, then your nervous system is continuously on alert. And in that moment, we actually have, I really regret we don't have more time, but I would be able to show you, we've got the graphs that are showing us that as your crisis center kind of activates and your CEO deactivates, right? The second that we are operating in a chronic stress, they kind of go like that and then never meet again, which means that you never go back down onto reactivating fully your CEO. It means that that's what I tried to mention to you in context of some of our executive functions actually diminish. They get, dysfunctional the longer we operate in chronic stress. Okay.
Thank you so much, Mary. I see we have two more questions and we have so short a time. Then let me see if I can get to one, and hopefully maybe we can, if you can answer briefly, maybe we'll be able to get to both. So Job says, is there a significant difference between men and women in adaptability regarding the operating of their brains and the reactions in stressful circumstances? So what's your response to that?
A lovely question. I love questions like that. So biologically, our brains are indeed a little bit different. Unfortunately, I will not give you a kind of satisfying response, I think, because the response is it depends. For example, if the female had just have a baby, the way that our brain gets restructured during that, it makes us a lot more alert and prone to look for certain cues, for example, that is meant to be, in favor of taking care of your offspring. However, that can, there are also equivalent elements for male, right? So it all depends in what stage of life and what situation you are and what kind of skills and awareness you have. Because even if you are a female and you might be right after giving birth, and it seems like a lot of circumstances are rewiring your brain for being more prone to crisis management center coming up. If you do have the right tactics and awareness, we actually see you are equally swiftly able to reactivate your CEO. So ultimately, yes, the changes are present in our brains because we have been designed slightly differently, but none of the changes makes one or the other gender better at leadership. It is making us just need to be aware even more so that we are able to basically lead our own self first before we try to lead anybody else. Aisha, do you have anything to add maybe to that one?
You've just rounded it up. I think any other thing would just dilute it. So I will leave it at that. Thank you very much,
Okay.
Mary. Very apt.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I see we are out of time. We do have one question. I don't know if we'll be able to respond to that in 30 seconds.
Let's try.
That says, how do we handle a situation that makes your responses seen
Oh,
or
I've
seen as
seen,
negative
Michael,
by
I've
your
seen
colleagues?
that on the chat, the question.
Yeah.
For the person who asked it, I think it was Uchechi, if I'm pronouncing this correctly.
So this is from Omolara Akonji.
Oh, there was
So
a
how do you
very
want?
similar one. So, guys,
Oh,
if you
okay.
want to connect with me on LinkedIn, happy to respond to that and give you any nuggets I can, because that is definitely not a 30-second response.
Okay. I figured. Yeah, so everyone, as I think Paul Adeyinka shared the link in a link for Mary in the chat box. And Aisha, if you would like to share yours as well, so that any of the attendees can reach out to you and ask questions and can share further insights and nuggets on this. But it's been an amazing conversation. Thank you so much, Mary. Thank you so much, Aisha, for those reflections, for bringing it home for us. And I guess so without taking much of your time, we would wrap it up here. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending this session. It's been an amazing session, and look forward to continuing sharing insights. Please feel free to join us, or would like to endeavor. Beseech you to join us next week as well, where we'll be discussing the business case for thriving organizational culture. We're going to have Dr. George Woods, the founder of the Culture Architects, and Pierre Yves Roberts, the founder, the co-founder of the Culture Architects, also being with us. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you so much again, Mary and Aisha, for sharing those amazing insights with us today. All right, everyone, we'll draw the curtains here and see you next week. Thank you.